So how exactly is this crisis panning out now? India, Canada, yes, those tensions are going to continue, but what effect is that going to happen with the rest of the West, and specifically with the United States? Well, who better to ask than Michael Kugelman, who's South Asia Institute Director at the Wilson Center. Michael, thanks so much for joining us. Great to be here in front of the White House. We often talk on Zoom, but it's great to be here in person with other protests taking place out here.
Absolutely.
What is your sense of where this crisis is at? It's now been 8-9 days. I don't see India trying to de-escalate or wanting to de-escalate, and neither are the Canadians. How is the US seeing this, and how is the West seeing this?
Well, I think that when this crisis first broke out, it was a major challenge, a major diplomatic, not a challenge, but a conundrum for the United States, in that it's relatively unusual for the US to have to confront a diplomatic crisis involving two partners of each other, both of whom were very close partners of the US as well. And so the US had to be very careful about how it messaged its public reaction. Canada is a treaty ally, a neighbor, an intelligence ally, whereas India, of course, is a close strategic partner. But I would argue that over the last few days or so, we've been hearing less from Washington about this, at least publicly. I mean, we know that the U.S. has delivered its public message that it's very concerned about these allegations and that it wants India to cooperate with Canada on in the investigation. But otherwise, the U.S. appears to have gone quiet publicly, which I think is a reflection of how delicate an issue
India was
it is.
actually, the U.S. was actually quiet in the first couple of days too, almost sort of taken by shock, and then it seemed as if the U.S. was ratcheting up the pressure. You had that remark made by Ambassador Cohen. You had other statements coming out saying, India needs to cooperate. Now it's sort of gone quiet again. Is it just because attention has moved elsewhere, or has the United States perhaps realized this may not be the right issue to pick a major fight with India?
Well, I think there's several factors at play here. One is that the U.S. has delivered the message it wanted to deliver, and it feels no need to make any other public pronouncements. I think we also cannot rule out the possibility that the messaging has gone private. I think that the U.S. government certainly could be seen as a potential third-party mediator, the actor that could sort of be in touch quietly, discreetly with both capitals to try to encourage them not to escalate further. So that could be happening. And as you know, in diplomacy, the important things happen behind the scenes more so than in the public domain.
I think in this case, the other thing which needs to be kept in mind is that there actually are two sides of the story. It's not as clear-cut as it looked. And we heard Mr. Jaishankar saying that at the United Nations. I think two things he said. One, you can't have a world where there are rule givers and rule takers. Right. It has to be a bit more nuanced than that. And again, making the point about that our reaction to violence and terrorism cannot be conditional, cannot be based on who you are. And he didn't actually target Canada specifically or by name, but the reference was crystal clear. Is that message something that you think he's also privately delivering here in Washington?
Oh, absolutely, for sure. I mean, we know that for quite some time, India's government has been concerned about these, what it believes to be very significant security threats, security concerns. And so I would not be surprised if Jaishankar is trying to deliver that message of trying to get the U.S. to understand India's position. And certainly there is a bit of a difference because, as you know, I think that the U.S. would sort of lean more on the side of the need to be careful and upholding democratic principles and allowing activists to be out there, as long as they're nonviolent, of course. Whereas, of course, India takes a very different position and would much prefer that Canada and other Western actors, including the United States, to pay more attention to this presence of Sikh separatist sentiment.
So the view in India has pretty much been 30 years or 40 years, we've tried to talk about this. And I think the reason why it's such an emotive issue is because it doesn't really exist inside India. It's almost as if somebody outside the country trying to reopen old wounds. And these are wounds that actually did spill a lot of blood in India.
Right.
I think that's the reason why there's been such an emotional and passionate response to this. And I think that's the reason why this is seen as a very serious issue in India. And I think that's also the reason why India's got so upset with Canada, that you're not taking this seriously enough, and you need to.
Right. No, absolutely. And I think that I can understand India's position that we've seen an increase in these Khalistan supporters demonstrating over the last few months. As you know, there were 2 incidents here in the U.S., in San Francisco, where the Indian consulate was attacked by, or there were attempted attacks by Khalistan supporters.
It happened in London, but the Indian High Commission was attacked.
Right, exactly. So
serious things.
some near misses here. So I could understand India's concerns that it's almost like there's some type of comeback or resurgence of this Khalistan movement, even if it's thousands of miles away from Indian soil.
So just to rephrase that, there's no resurgence of the Khalistan movement, right? The Khalistan movement is dead. These are a bunch of people sitting in a foreign country, come out here and wave flags and saying, let's have a Khalistan movement or let's have a referendum.
Right.
So it's not actually a movement which is there in India right now.
Well, of course, but I think this is part of the issue, part of the crisis, in that India is taking a very hard line and has used terms like terrorism, extremism to refer to these expressions of Sikh separatism in the West, even though it's true. I mean, it's a very small number of demonstrators, and I would argue that you've got very sizable Sikh communities here and in Canada, in both cases about 800,000 strong, and the majority of them have no interest in Khalistan, and certainly are not violent either. But given how tense things are now between Canada and India, if you have even a few dozen Khalistan supporters coming out on the streets, congregating near Indian consulate facilities around Canada, burning effigies of Prime Minister Modi, obviously that's not going to help move the crisis toward a resolution.
Protests like this, which we've been hearing for hours out here, are one thing. They're not actually inciting anybody to violence. There are no posters out there saying assassinate Indian diplomats, right? Which is a slightly different question. Which brings me to the question of the rules of the game, and I'm sure you've been hearing this a lot from various Indian interlocutors. In a situation where security threats, where there are terrorist threats to a country, the United States or many other countries in the West would not hesitate. Canada supported drone strikes in various parts of Afghanistan or Syria or other countries, because they said it's a question of safety, it's a question of terrorism. I guess the question that India is asking, and other countries will ask that question also, is why don't those same rules apply to us?
Right. I mean, and part of the issue is, a reflection of, to put it mildly, U.S. inconsistent policy. One could argue a policy that's hypocritical. Many would argue that the U.S. decision to take out Qasem Soleimani in Iraq, that was a state-sponsored assassination.
It's not just him and Osama bin Laden. Look at the number of drone strikes that took place. How many people died in drone strikes? 10,000?
Yeah.
So there were many people who were being killed in drone strikes. Some of them could have been innocent. There's at least 1,000 civilians.
Right, exactly. So, my broader point is that I think a lot of this comes down to perceptions, threat perceptions, right? I mean, Khalistan, those violent proponents of the Khalistan movement, it's not a direct threat to the United States. It's not a direct threat to the West because the intended target is India. That's one reason for the disconnect, though certainly because what's left of the Khalistan movement, or if you want to call it a new phase of this Khalistan movement, they're based in the West. They're based in Canada, the US, Australia, the UK, and I think that they are operating from Canadian soil, from US soil, making threats to Indian diplomats based in the West. That's a bit of a concern, I think, and I would think a point that Indian officials would want to make to their Western interlocutors, that yes, this may not be directed at you, at the West, but from Western soil, threats are being made against India.
So 2 or 3 possible things in the forward. I'm sure everyone's going to wait for this evidence to see what the evidence is, and that's one part.
If it comes.
If it comes, if it exists, frankly, we'll have to see what happens with that. But 2 other things, I think India is going to try and make a very strong point that you've got to do something about these Khalistani extremists in their soil. And a third is coming back to the question of the rule-based order.
Right.
The world is right now in a situation where you've got revisionist powers like China and Russia and Iran and others who are saying, we don't believe in the rules of the game. The West would presumably want India to be aligned with the rule-based order, but then at some point a case has to be made, what would be the fair rules that would be applicable to everybody? Is there any thinking on that taking place in the building behind me or elsewhere here in Washington?
Well, I mean, it's quite striking, as I'm sure you noted, that when Prime Minister Trudeau made his speech at the House of Commons bringing out the allegations against India, he invoked that term, rules-based order. His view was that an assassination by another government on Canadian soil represents a threat to the rules-based order. And of course, Jaishankar in his speech at the UN sort of poked back at that, I think.
And said we're all for a rules-based order, but what is the rule? How should the rules-based order be defined? Because it has to apply to everyone.
And that's the problem. And I think it's very relative, right? I mean, it's going to be defined differently in different contexts. Clearly, the Indo-Pacific vision of a rules-based order is something that generally there's a lot of agreement from Canada and the Five Eyes allies, India and others that are invested in this effort to counter China. But indeed, I think it's one of these catchphrases that will be invoked just because you'll get a certain type of reaction because it's got that kind of currency. But at the end of the day, do we really know what a rules-based order actually is or is supposed to be? I'm not sure. There have been efforts to define it in the Indo-Pacific, but again, it's one of these catch-all terms.
So I've heard some commentary on the internet where it says rules-based order means that you should not have assassinations in another democracy. Now that's one way of looking at it, or in a country where the rule of law or justice systems operate. And that's one way of defining it. But then the question is, what if that justice system is not operating as is in this case, with the Canadians have not cooperated on terrorism? Then what happens to the rules-based order?
Right, so one could argue that it takes a hit. But again, the core issue is how to define it and how to generate a broader global consensus around this idea and trying to uphold it. And it doesn't exist. I frankly think that it wasn't a wise move for Prime Minister Trudeau to invoke that term. There was no reason to. We know why he was trying to do it. He was trying to generate support.
He was trying to get the rest of the West together, right? Here's India now standing up, trying to upturn the rules-based order, which is what I think he was trying to do.
Right, exactly.
Right, well, Michael, let's see where this shapes up. Let's also try and get some sense from other experts on where this is headed. Thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure. And good to meet you in person here.
Very nice to meet you as well.